This popped up on my timeline the other day, and at first I simply sighed, thinking, oh, let me guess, somebody's triggered they've been called a tourist.
I've been called a hobby tourist.
And here we go, a video made by a man triggered by a term he does not know, denying a phenomenon he does not understand, and running defense for people whose agenda he would probably be horrified by if he could ever fully comprehend it. And so, I screenshotted it, expected it to be taken down swiftly thereafter, made fun of it, and moved on with my day. But then I came to thinking that a video like this, as eminently predictable as it is likely to be, would be the perfect repository of every normie take, every midwit argument, and thus could be used as an excellent demonstration of the more doctrinal low IQ interventions and how to counter them. And boy, I was not disappointed, as we start with quibbling about the definition of the word tourist in relations to travel, where our normie friend goes on to say that hobby tourism is a stupid term.
Hobby tourist is a stupid term.
And why is it a stupid term? Well, because tourism is exploring a new area, looking around and learning what it's all about.
Usually refers to travel and going places you've never been, to experience the area and learn more about it and whatnot.
And in sharp contrast to this, looking into a new hobby is like...
And you sort of look around to see what it's like.
Well, if this is the level of insight I am in for, this video will be well worth my time. As beyond, of course, simply explaining why the term tourist is an accurate descriptor of being a tourist. The point, of course, is that yes, we are all tourists into a hobby when we first enter it, because we have no express intention to delve fully into the hobby when we first pick it up. We are simply approaching something new and thinking, okay, this could be interesting, let me find out more about it and see if it is for me or not. And there is, of course, an implied transition in this term, in that if you look at the hobby and go, this wasn't actually for me, you will no longer be a tourist because you will drift away from it. Whereas if you go, this is for me, and you join the hobby, you are also no longer a tourist because you have embraced the hobby. And this is why the term tourist is a recent one, as frankly, back in the day, we didn't need it. You either joined or you didn't. That was about as simple as it was. There were no other vectors to consider. But today, where hobbies have become a cultural and political battleground by design, things are a lot more complicated. And these are complications that our normie friend have only the most baseline conceptualizations of. For example, he does recognize that yes, indeed, tourist is intended to be a disparaging term.
The term hobby tourist, it isn't a real thing, it's a pejorative.
But then goes on to, I wouldn't say muddy the waters, because I genuinely don't think he understands what he's talking about, by saying this.
People call other people hobby tourists because they disagree with that person. Pure and simple. Whatever they might be saying, they disagree with it.
Whatever they might be saying, they disagree with. And what is the nature of this disagreement, exactly? Well, he dances around the point quite a bit, but then finally brings up...
inclusivity, for example.
Inclusivity. Now this is where things get interesting, because inclusivity, which is of course a part of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a political ideology with pretty gosh darn massive roots, but our normie here, of course, has no clue about any of that, which we'll get back to as a point a little bit later on, but let me go back in time in the video a little bit to more properly illustrate his point.
So where does this concept of the hobby tourist come from? Well, it's basically a conspiracy theory that some folks like to believe. They believe that these hobby tourists are people out there who don't buy or build or paint or collect or play or read or do anything wargaming, but yet somehow these people are making a lot of noise in the industry, mainly via social media, about the way that they want things to be. Maybe it's inclusivity, maybe it's politics, whatever, but these folks can allegedly steer the big companies in wargaming to do whatever it is that they want, to follow their hobby tourist agenda. In actuality, the big corporations in wargaming, and let's just be honest, it's pretty much mostly Games Workshop, they don't listen to the opinions of paying customers, let alone, weird randos on the internet.
So, to steelman his position as much as possible, it appears to be that the term hobby tourist is a conspiracy theory that alleges that there are groups of people out there who do not engage with the hobby on any level beyond making noise on social media, and that the companies then react to this noise and put in place the various demands that they are forwarding, which he views as ridiculous because Games Workshop doesn't listen to their customers. And hey, at least on that point, he is absolutely dead on correct. As when Games Workshop's authors put black Africans on Fenris, that is not because the consumers asked for it. The paying customers are not begging for female custodies. They are not clamoring for diversity, or you will not be missed. But beyond this doctrinal point of the companies don't listen to you, which in terms of GW is probably actually true, unfortunately, and thus because of that there is no way that any tourists, theoretical or not, could influence the company, once that programming is at an end, he stops thinking. As the next logical question would of course be, I wonder who it is that GW does listen to. Well, they listen to their writers, their HR department, both incredibly progressive. They listen to their government, who is so progressive that they've created special privileged classes within society, whom, if you criticize or are mean to, the police will come to your house and correct you. And GW listen to billion-dollar investment agencies, all of which have been affected over the course of not mere years, but decades by an ideology tailor-made to target the weak points in our liberal political systems, in our culture, and in our morality. We know this because the people who made this system told us, and in fact, are still telling us. And this is where we get the people on social media, the tourists, who place their politics above the hobby. Now again, our Midwits says this.
But the idea that people get involved in a hobby with no intention of staying if they like it is ridiculous.
And hey, 20 years ago, this would be a reasonable position. But today, there are people who join hobbies for reason other than enjoying the hobby. In fact, in his tweet announcing the video, there were some nice people giving examples of just that, like Cerberus here, the painter of the Pride Marines, one of the most lovely examples of somebody placing politics above the hobby, stating that, all of that murdering gets really boring in 40k, and that, yeah, it should totally be about romance instead of action. Or people who simply say that the franchise should die because there are too many people who enjoy it that they don't agree with. There are also people who simply just reject the fundaments of the universe by saying, oh, Black library doesn't make lore or anything, or simply people who don't know anything about the setting that they are masquerading around in, wearing as a skin suit primarily for clout first and foremost, as, I mean, I don't want to purity test too much, but if your icon is of a chaos chick and you don't know what word bearer means, yeah, you're probably just wearing the hobby as a skin suit. Oh, and on the note of the definition of hobby tourists, by the way, he does actually ask what the definition is.
I'd love to know what the cutoff is between hobby tourist and serious hobbyist. I'll bet there's not anything near a clear definition.
And well, you would indeed lose that bet, because the definition of a tourist is very simple. It is somebody who places their politics and prioritizes it above their hobby, and who must then insert their politics into the hobby, because that is the doctrine, that is the idea of the politics, to replace everything that is and is normal with their own view of politicized normal. And this is, of course, an act that no hobby can survive, as it will inevitably transform the hobby into something completely different. I've gone over this in more detail in another video, and we are not going to delve too deeply into Gramsci or Crenshaw again today, as it will be far easier to illustrate why Games Workshop are making these political changes to their universe because of the people they are listening to, the activist organizations, the investors, and their government, by moving on to our Midwits core argument, the "it's not happening" argument.
The only thing that they listen to is sales, not opinions. That's how massive corporations work. Huge corporations with shareholders do everything that they do to make more money. If they don't believe that a change will increase profit, then they just won't do it. When a massive corporation decides to embrace something like inclusivity, for example, it's not really because they think it's the right thing. People in the organization individually might, but the organization itself doesn't think it's necessarily the right thing. It is the right thing, in my opinion, frankly, but the corporation, they know that including more people into the potential, customer base means more potential sales and more potential profit. It's a simple business equation, honestly.
Giant corporations only listen to sales. That's why they embrace inclusivity, because it gives them more sales. Oh boy. This is one of the slam dunkiest of slam dunks of points to shoot down, because it is one of those most beautiful of progressive lies. It even has a touch of truth, because yes, many of these corporations don't really necessarily care. There is absolutely an element of the activist within many of these companies, like Disney, for example, but the core business idea back in the day, the original idea, was that somebody came to them and said, hey, there is a massive diverse audience out there. You could triple, quadruple your revenue if only you cater to it. And the corporations thought, oh my god, alright, let's do that. Let's try it out. And often, these people whispering in their ears were professional activists as well. We can look at Sweet Baby Inc., for example, who expressly and deliberately pushed the political agenda of diversity, equity, and inclusion into companies. And when, of course, our midwit inevitably responds with diversity isn't political, or some semblance of that, ask if discrimination based on race is good. When they say no, point to Disney, having discriminated based on race in their hiring practices, in the now publicly released guidelines, again, expressly for diversity's sake. And if you're feeling particularly cruel, follow up by asking what the political origins of DEI is. Is there anything actually liberal about DEI? Is it colorblind, meritocratic, individualistic? Or maybe it is actively racially profiling, hiring based on immutable characteristics or protected characteristics, as we call them today, over merit, and collectivist as a Russian gulag. And finally, twist the knife on the profitability argument by pointing out the bountiful rewards enjoyed by countless companies having invested into DEI. As whilst it sounded like a good idea to make a product for everyone, it turned out that the only product that is for everyone is watery gruel. And very few people will actually choose watery gruel when there is literally any other option. Then we move on from it's not happening to it doesn't matter if it is happening.
Hobbies are for fun. That's why we do them. I feel like sometimes people forget that, right? It's a hobby, a leisure activity, not life and death. Who gets to judge whether you're serious enough about it or not, right?
I do. What? You're not happy with that? I thought it didn't matter, so surely if I am the one who decides, there's no problems with that. It's nothing serious after all. This is all just trivial, right? The good old-fashioned appeal to triviality. It's all just for fun. The hobby isn't serious or anything, and there are far more important things, which I imagine can probably be summed up with 3 letters. A D, an E, and an I. Now, it might be tempting to try to explain that there are identifiable groups and individuals within a hobby that is doing things to the hobby for reasons other than fun. That there are people who actually seem to dislike fundamental parts of the hobby and wishes to replace them with other things, or who even wishes the hobby to simply be destroyed because there are too many wrong people liking it, all demonstrated by the previous screenshots. But don't. It's pearls before swine. It is simply enough to say, well, it is serious and important to me. So if it is not serious and important to you, then why don't you shut up and do as I say? After all, it's nothing serious, right? It's just made-up stories, right? So I can do whatever I want with it. Which, by the by, is of course word for word what the progressive argument was to get Midwits on board in the first place, so its usefulness has already been proven. And this segues quite nicely into the next point, where we go from it doesn't matter to okay, it is happening, and okay, it does matter that it's happening, but you don't have a counter-argument for why it shouldn't happen.
If someone calls you a hobby tourist online, or like maybe even in person, I suppose, but that's way less likely, then just know that they simply disagree with you and want to try to degrade the validity of your opinion by saying you're not a true wargamer, you're just a tourist, right? Like, they don't have anything substantial to reply with to your point, so instead, they decided to judge your commitment to the hobby. It's basically an ad hominem attack, and it's usually pretty easy to spot, and it should be pretty easy to ignore as well.
Oh, Lord. There is practically no wrong answer to this one. You can point towards how progressivism has ruined entertainment, how it's messed up our economy, how it's ruined our social and cultural integrity, how it has led to some of the most divisive times in modern history, how it is actively undermining the fundaments of our social order, how the inevitable end point of progressivism is to ever progress. Which is why the Pride movement started out as orderly requests for the same rights as everybody else. An entirely reasonable request to, hey, what if we just display our fetishes in public for a month? Which will inevitably devolve into even less palatable things. This being the part I was referencing when I said, would be horrified by if he could ever fully comprehend it. But the point here is that you should try to keep it local. Bring up an example you know well, like in 40K, the female custodies, and how the gaslighting campaign that followed was obviously not a good faith maneuver by Games Workshop in any shape or form. And the only possible, conceivable reason they would have done this is for political reasons. And that there is, of course, only one political leaning right now that is constantly weaponizing identity. And don't get me wrong, you could go into full details here as well. This kind of references an earlier point as well. You could decide to start with Gramsci's ideas that a socialist revolution was impossible because of the hegemonic cultural dominance of capitalism based on consent. Thus, there could not be a radical socialist revolution, as the very people that needed to rise up were actually quite happy and content with the system it had. Consequentially, socialism was denied its, up until then, primary intended method for achieving power, a revolution and a violent overthrow of the preceding order. Gramsci then posited that a radical change in approach was required. Socialism would instead aim to achieve first subversive and then ultimately consensual domination over civil society by embracing the established institutions of capitalism, and liberalism more usefully, then gradually expanding its own values and theses into these institutions using liberalism as the sheep's skin, before eventually subsuming and replacing these liberal organizations, institutions, morals, and eventually a complete replacement of the sense of normalcy. Until progressivist ideals, up until then masquerading as liberal ideals, are simply just the accepted cultural norm. And to do this, of course, required the infiltration of all levels of society, where the personal is political is the spearhead, thus making hobbies political, making movies political, making television shows political, making music political, making everything inherently and automatically political. Until, by design, there is no escape from the political, from the new normal world order. And hell, that is a brief, simplistic summary of one point of progressivism. As here are the two problems with trying to get into detail. One, it will take forever to adequately explain the myriad levels of progressivism's effect on our society, from its corruption of liberalism to its cannibalization of feminism, to the creation of intersectionality, etc., etc. And, even more importantly, number two, I damn near guarantee you that your average midwit has never even heard the name Antonio Gramsci, or Shulamit Firestone, or Kimberly Crenshaw, etc., etc. To put it bluntly, explaining all of this is again pearls before swine, a wasted effort, as the average hobby, or tourist if you will, progressive, has no understanding of the theory behind the ideas they parrot. This in and of itself is another layer of why progressivism has managed to infiltrate our society as deeply as it has, as this again is the sheep's skin we mentioned. So instead, I'm just going to point out a previous point from our Midwits video.
In the real world, I don't want my doctor to be a medical hobbyist. That stuff is much more serious than toy soldiers, games, and like made-up stories.
And that is the reason why you should probably not be talking about things you don't know a whole lot about. As demonstrated by you not understanding gatekeeping, why it is important, or how having people in the hobby who actively wish to change the hobby into something else for political reasons could, I don't know, damage the hobby.
And if it's not clear, calling someone a hobby tourist is a real kind of gatekeeper kind of activity. Gatekeepers can harm the growth of a community even though they think they're saving it somehow for the non-tourists. Pretty much every hobby I can think of is better off when it brings in more people as opposed to fewer. So the concept of, keeping the wrong people out is really problematic, obviously.
Problematic. Man, that's not a word I've heard since, 2018, perhaps? My dude, your progressivist software is really quite badly out of date. But hey, that is also why you make for such an excellent example of the old school doctrine. So, I'm going to take a moment on this point here to try and hammer this one out, because why would you keep people out? You love the hobby, or don't you want to share it with as many people as you want? Don't you want the hobby to do well? Is a nice, emotionally laden argument. The issue is, there are people who will actually destroy a hobby. There are people who actually enjoy destroying and undermining hobbies and settings because they wish to enforce their own things upon that hobby. The most recent and brilliant example being Star Wars and The Acolyte. The Acolyte is a series that takes a big steaming dump on virtually every single solitary aspect of Star Wars. It takes a dump on the Jedi, reducing them to nothing more than trigger-happy space cops, who were incidentally fully justified in their actions. It takes a dump on Darth Sidious, reducing one of the most dangerous, insidious, and evil Dark Force wielders ever to a plagiarist, who simply stole his ideas for creating life from a bunch of lesbian space witches who were way cleverer than Darth Sidious, of course, as not only did they achieve what he failed to do, they created twins on the first try, and apparently incredibly Force-sensitive twins as well. This too in turn takes a dump on the Force, as Anakin and eventually Luke was a response to Darth Sidious' machinations, and yet now I guess the Force must have missed the other two twins that happened before. It takes a dump on the Old Republic, 1,000 years of peace, well, except for that, that one Sith and that other Sith and, that whole coven of lesbian space witches creating Force wielders, etc. Except for that. It takes a dump on Yoda, who apparently forgot all about that this happened even after being read in on it. It even takes a direct dump on the fans by going, hey, we know you all wanted Wookiee Jedi, we've got a Wookiee Jedi here, aren't you excited? The Wookiee Jedi dies off screen without so much as even a fight scene. All of this, and so much more bad in the Star Wars universe today, is created by people like Leslie Headland who don't give a shit about the universe. They care about leaving their own mark. They care about, that Darth Sidious dude? I did that. I was the one who actually inspired him, you see. Yeah, no, that was me. Oh, the Old Republic thing? Yeah, no, that was all lies, by the way. It wasn't all peaceful. The Jedi were abusive space cops. What's that? I myself seem to have a vested interest in hating the popos. Yeah, dead on. That is exactly it. And yes, incidentally, this is the most racially diverse and gayest Star Wars ever, because those are the things that Leslie Headland cares about. Getting a role for her wife in the show. The simple fact fact that our midwit here can apparently not conceptualize a situation in which bringing in people like this could damage a hobby tells me again that he is either malicious or simply ignorant. And you know what? I have a charitable interpretation here. I think this guy is simply ignorant. He doesn't strike me as malicious, he just strikes me as not very educated about the matters he elected to try to talk about. As this is, of course, an inevitability, and it is one that we should have realized before those of us in the hobby kicked open the doors to everyone. Because here's the thing. If you have a hobby like 40k, whose primary selling point, whose main identifying factor is grimdark, and you then bring in people who are, oh, I like the idea of painting little miniatures, but what's with this grimdarky nonsense? Don't you know that heroes need to be progressive, better, brighter? Let's get rid of that. Let's make this hope punk, shall we? These are some pretty miniatures, by the way. Look, I painted mine in the colors of the pride flag. Then you will have fundamentally changed the nature of 40k, and thus it is no longer 40k. And the immediate, I can already hear it, counter to that is, but the hobby has always been changing, constant flux, first and foremost. No, it hasn't. 40k has been a remarkably sedentary hobby. In fact, that was one of the primary complaints about 40k for about 2 decades. But even if we were to include Rogue Trader in this, which I don't, it has always been a pretty damn grim and dark setting. More tongue-in-cheek back in the day, certainly, but it's always been quite dark. And today, the defining nature of 40k is, again, as mentioned, absolutely grim dark. But you cannot have progressive grimdark, because progressivism is an ideology that divides the world into good and evil. It is one of the greater good. And once one has a greater good, no action carried out in its name can be bad. They cannot be immoral because you have the greater good. You have the absolute truth. It is black and it is white. It is not grimdark. But, luckily, this is a tide that is turning. Progressivism, wokeism, and tourists are being chased from virtually every company, every entertainment entity. And so, I wish to end with a positive note from our midwit here.
If you don't agree with things that are happening in your hobby, don't attack other hobbyists. Be the change you want to see.
That is right. Be the change you want to be, people. You are the ones changing culture. You are the ones determining what is and is not acceptable. Vote both with your wallets and with your minds and your words. Do not merely deprive the company of financial gains, convince others to deny the company of financial gains. Make it culturally unacceptable to be pro-woke. Make that word the mark of Satan. It is already so well on its way to becoming. Make the simple accusation of a product being woke the equivalent of the progressives, Nazi, racist, misogynist. That is the change we need, and that is the change we are creating. And it is a stick that shall be applied liberally for quite some time. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.